So you already know about me. Don't need to talk about me. So what are we going to talk about? Again, this is kind of just a high level. Ideally, if you've been following along with the you've been following along the series, you have an idea of where Power BI makes sense. You've thought about what makes sense as kind of a first project. And so this is kind of just okay. What are some high level considerations when it comes to report design in general, no matter what tool you're using, and some things specific to Power BI. But we won't be talking about, say, all the different types of visuals and things about. Specifically, we're going to talk about some basic principles. We're going to talk a little bit about understanding your audience, but we're going to go through that a little bit faster because that's going to be a bit of a rehash of some stuff we've already talked about. We're going to talk about kind of the spiral approach that I recommend when working with Power BI of making sure the main content's there and then adding in detail, because Power BI does really well in supporting kind of incremental adding of detail and context. And then finally, I have some suggested reading that you may want to check out. But one of the things with this is when it comes to the visualization piece, I am winging it like everybody else, right? My background is more on the programming side. And so, if we think about the layers of Power BI, when it comes to anything that involves code, I am awesome, right? If it involves data modeling, data cleansing, if I can write code for it, if I can validate, hey, I wanted this column to display this data, I can show whether it does or not. I feel pretty good about that. But when it comes to the aesthetic piece, that's always been kind of the weakest part for me, because a report and its visualizations isn't something that compiles, right? You don't get an error message. It's this gradient of how well was it received, how well was it understood. And a lot of times, people don't know what can be done with the tool. So they might say that they're happy with the end result, but there's a much better way of doing it or displaying it. And so when it comes to how to design your reports in terms of visualization, there's this kind of gradient of 4 different principles that I think are important. So the first thing is make it legible. Can we read it to begin with? Can we understand it to begin with? This is where a lot of the self-service work falls down the most, is people will try to put on just so much content onto one page, or without a particular ordering, it can be a little bit difficult to understand everything that's on the page. The next thing is to consider making it accessible. And this is for 2 reasons. So the first is the number of people with some type of handicap is far larger than you might anticipate. I want to say for men, 1 in 12 men, or about 8%, have some type of color blindness, for example. And so there's plenty of people where improved accessibility, it very explicitly helps them. But then it also just helps everyone else. Better contrast, better readability helps everyone else. And I learned this the hard way with my presentations, where last year I presented at SQL Saturday, and we were presenting onto, like, not quite bed sheets, but sheets on the wall, because they didn't want to pay for the AV support, which I understand. But it made it so that the colors were kind of washed out, and it was on these personal projectors and everything. And so by focusing on accessibility in my presentation, everyone benefited, because it would have been impossible to read my report or read my presentation. Same thing applies to reports. Next, make it scannable. And I don't mean putting it in a scanner or anything like that. What I mean is make it so that your eyes can kind of dart around and very quickly find the most important pieces of information. Make it so you don't have to process everything on the page. And then finally, make it useful. Which maybe should be the first thing. It's kind of hard to say, but in terms of the visualization piece, you really want to make sure that it's adding value. You made it so that it's easy to use, easy to understand, but I could tell you the number of species of trees. That's not going to help you in your day-to-day work. So make it legible. Well, the first thing, increase the font size. Um, do more with less. When Power BI first came out, the default font size was 8 points, which is tiny, right? They've gotten better. I think it's like 10 or 12 now, but still, one of the first things to do is increase the font size. We don't need to be displaying so much information all on one page. We have ways, which I'll talk about, of adding contextual detail, and larger font is just more readable in general. And so think about increasing the font size, improve the contrast. So be very careful to make sure that you have a high amount of contrast. And that doesn't necessarily mean using sharp, bright colors or anything like that, but just be aware that, things like black on a white background works very well. Um, be aware of color blindness and those sorts of things, but just be careful with too much of the light grays and all these sorts of things that may look neat or look nuanced, but are actually quite difficult to read. Another thing is make use of white space, right? Again, you would think with some of the reports that we've worked on that people feel like they're paying per pixel, and you're not, right? There's a certain cost in terms of usability if you have like 20 different pages or something like that, but in general, white space improves the readability and legibility of the report, and so don't be afraid to use it to help organize the content, to make it clear where the eye should flow, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, minimize clutter. There's plenty of little lines and aesthetic details and things that aren't necessary. Um, Again, fewer visualizations is often better. So that's all stuff to make it just readable. Another thing to consider is making it accessible. And so, like I said, improve the contrast. And so these ratios come from, I think it's the Web something accessibility guidelines. The acronym's WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, I believe. But there are guidelines out there for making web-based content, and technically Power BI in a lot of cases is web-based content. And so you want to give some consideration to contrast because it matters for color blindness. It matters as we get older. There's just a number of people that it affects. And again, you don't always know in what context your report's going to be viewed. And so there's some situations where low contrast can be difficult. As I already said, be mindful of color blindness. There are plenty of tools out there to check and see what a image or web page would look like given a certain type of color blindness, and there's a bunch of different types out there. We have the 3 different types of, I always forget if it's the rods or the cones, but we see red, green, and blue, and sometimes one of those types of sensors doesn't work. And so there's actually quite a few different types of color blindness. One of the things that I will say is, at least I haven't done an actual test on this, but from what I can tell looking at it, the defaults for Power BI are pretty good. I think they've always had some consideration for color blindness in that regard. You don't see red versus green being used as the defaults, for example, for say conditional formatting and that sort of thing. The original set of Power BI colors were really, really ugly. And so they made some improvements there. But that's one of the things is a lot of times I'll do blue versus red, for example, to make it a little bit more readable if someone has color blindness. Another thing is use clear chart titles. If you're going above and beyond, consider setting the tab order and any alternate text for any images. And this is in particular for anyone who is has limited vision or is blind and is using a screen reader. So there are things that you can do to make it so that those kind of folks are able to consume your reports. This tend to make more sense in very large organizations, but it's something to think about. And Megan Longoria has an entire category and tons of blog posts about these sorts of things. So I definitely recommend reading her content. She's one of the few people I see regularly blogging about this sort of stuff. And again, a lot of times things that make your content better for people with some type of handicap will often make it better for everyone else. And one thing to really consider is try the squint test when it comes to your report. Can you, with this blurred out, shrunken picture, get an idea of what's going on in the report and what's being communicated. If the answer is no, then you may want to think about redesigning your report. Obviously, the squint test doesn't work for very detailed tabular information, but for the stuff that involves charts and visuals and things, you should be able to do it and should be able to succeed. And so this is a really good way of getting an idea of how well does your chart quickly communicate the information that you care about. And so, I've worked with plenty of reports that would fail the squint test. Plenty of the ones I've made would at first fail the squint test. And so something to think about. And this in particular is using the screenshot I took is using an add-in. One of those posts or one of the top level pieces has a list of tools. And so the picture that I took, I was able to take that by using a browser plugin, actually. So you can kind of see it there, but this is actually really cool. It's a browser plugin. Again, I can try to find a link later, but it's from one of her blog posts of different tools. And it's really cool because you can change the blur level. So again, you can look at reports that you've created and say, okay, how readable is this? And so it's both a matter of accessibility, but readability or legibility, however you want to define those terms. And so this is just a really great thing to consider. And I find this applies to a bunch of things. I like to be able to use this for my presentations in general, right? Sometimes I forget to do this, but I like to be able to say, okay, if I was standing at the back of a room without my glasses on, could I understand what's on the screen? Could I see what's on the screen? If I was looking at my phone at arm's length, could I understand what's on the screen? So the third thing that I want to talk about is to make it scannable. So the whole idea is that when we consume content on the web, and I'll have a link for this in the references, they've done studies with eye tracking software. And when we read content on the web, we don't just read everything from top to bottom. This isn't, a newspaper back in the day, although people probably didn't even read it that way. They jumped to page A2 because there was some car crash or something. But, it's not like a book where we read it from top to bottom. We scan, we jump around. And so one of the things I really like to do is start with the summary at the very top, right? Because, with the exception of maybe Arabic and Hebrew, we generally read, well, maybe Japanese depending, but we generally in Western cultures read from top to bottom and left to right. And so you want to make sure that your content works with that default kind of flow. Um, and so you want to have your summary at the top. You want it so they can get the core information that they need, or at the very least, if it's less about high level KPIs and more about understanding the state of things, they can see if there's any anomalies or things they should be looking into more very quickly. Next is make use of color and conditional formatting. The conditional formatting has gotten way, way better with Power BI than it used to be. It's not quite at the same level as Excel, but there's a lot of flexibility with like rule-based conditional formatting, writing your own measure to specify colors and all those sorts of things. And it's really, really good way to help identify outliers and anomalies and all those sorts of things. It's also good for KPIs to say, are we doing well? Or are we doing poorly? Again, you have to give some consideration to if you're going to use the whole red versus green kind of piece for accessibility reasons. And again, use white space. And so white space not only helps to separate the content to make it easier to read, but white space can help guide the eyes. It can help identify, okay, here's the top level stuff, here's the detail kind of stuff. And so it can help guide where the eyes are going to flow to. Another thing is something called pre-attentive attributes. So there's another book that I will reference later on, but it's the idea of there are certain things that you can distinguish before you're even aware of it. We're talking sub-second kind of stuff. And those tend to be things like color, size, shape, thickness, all these sorts of things. And so there's a number of different of these pre-attentive attributes they can make it so people can kind of read or understand your report before they're even aware of it. And then, like I already said, there's a book called "Don't Make Me Think" by Steve Krug, and it's about web design, and it has reference to those eye tracking studies. And this was kind of a mind blowing moment for me to realize that people will read a header, scan, read a header, jump around, all this kind of stuff. And so I think it is very good to build your reports similar to how you might write blog posts or something like that in a way that allows people to jump around. Another thing with the white space and some of these other things is I usually I don't get a chance to on the projects that we do, but I am a big fan of background images. Not necessarily ones as complicated as this. You can make them pretty easily in PowerPoint, but I've found it useful for a number of reasons because it can be really helpful templates for people making new reports, and it can just really help with that eye flow. So again, I don't know if I would go as far as they've gone here, where each and every visual has its own little box. But I have been on a project before where we paid a graphic designer to make some like top third, bottom two thirds, left third, right two thirds kind of templates. And that kind of use of white space and color and lines and things can really help draw the eye, help guide the eye. Usually, whenever I'm doing something like this, it tends to be something as simple as some white space and then a couple lines using the insert shape tool. And you'd be amazed how much that can just, again, help break things up a little bit so that the brain quickly understands, okay, here's the KPI information, here's the detailed information. Um, and so finally, in terms of those 4 best practices, you want to make it usable. And so the first thing is to understand your audience. We'll talk about this. You want to understand their needs, and you want to enable self-service and data exploration. And so we're going to hop through this kind of quickly because we've talked about it previously. But the big question is, who is Power BI designed for? Who are these reports designed for? And Power BI originally was a set of Excel add-ins. So you had Power Query, which is still there, but it's called Get and Transform Data. You had Power Pivot, which is still there and supports the DAX language. You had Power View, which was a Silverlight based visualization piece, and you had Power Map, which was this 3D mapping kind of thing. And Microsoft, as I've mentioned before, designed Power BI for business users and for self-service. And so you get this kind of tension between self-service or centralization. And so you have to think about, okay, well, how am I going to design my report to support both, right? Do I want to have something fully centralized, where it's basically these endorsed, supported reports? Is there somewhere in the middle, or do I want to be all the Wild Wild West? Is like, here's the data, go and make your reports, or here's some of the high level stuff. My general preference is kind of a hybrid approach, where we may have the basics of viewing and playing around with filters, but then we can have this kind of gradient of exploring the data and even some modeling and making reports and content. And so, as I mentioned before, self-service BI is creating this business meeting without needing IT help. And so something I've talked about is we have these 3 types of users. We've got report consumers, report explorers, and report producers. And so the thing that matters, though, is how does this relate to the actual visualization piece? And so the way that you support all 3, in my opinion, the way you support kind of this hybrid approach is you want to support building things incrementally. I think when it comes to Power BI, that's the most effective. I think we've had the most success with customers with this kind of incremental approach. And so it means we iterate and expand. And so the very first thing is just displaying the raw data. Very rarely is this what we present to the customer, but this is a really good starting point of like, okay, I just need to import the data. So this is where I always start when it comes to actually building the report. But very quickly, we can add on business meaning to that raw data. We can start defining some of the business logic that makes the business kind of unique in this case. And up until this point in the pyramid, Excel is a better tool. SQL Server Reporting Services is a comparable tool. Where Power BI starts to excel is whenever we start to add interaction to it. We add ways that you can apply filters, that you can do drill throughs, and then eventually we add contextual information. So we can do cross filtering. So you click on something and filter one part of a visualization, and it filters over to a different visualization. And so what does this look like as we work our way up this pyramid? So at the beginning, we just have raw data. Here's some data from AdventureWorks, and it's just as is. And again, uh, if you're just doing this, you should just be using Excel because it's just better for just raw descriptive data. But then we can start adding meaning. We can start defining things and say, okay, here's a calculated column for line total. And again, this is an area where Excel tends to be pretty comparable. But the way that we start supporting those more advanced users is by adding in interaction. And so what types of interactions are available to us? So the default and the most obvious one are filters. There's an entire filter pane. I always have something in there so that it's not just a descriptive report. It's something that users, if they want to, can take the next step and dig around in the data. Another thing are cross filters. And so you a lot of times want to have enough visualizations on the page, at least for the main page that they're going to be in most of the time. So that if they click on a bar in a bar chart, it filters the data over on the table or what have you. And so this can be really, really powerful and works really well for, okay, I've got a bar chart or some other, like a line chart with kind of high level information. And then I've got one or two detailed tables. And so I click on one to try and figure out what's going on with some sort of anomaly. And I can get my answers all on the same page with just a little bit of interaction. And this is where you start getting features that just aren't really particularly available in, say, Excel or SQL Server reporting services. Finally, you've got drill down. So drill down is whenever you have some type of hierarchical information, maybe like country, state, city, or something like that, or product category, product name, and allows you, say, in that bar chart to go down a level below and look at all of the more detailed or granular pieces of that hierarchy. Finally, we want to add context. And this is where kind of the wow factor starts to come in and where you can support kind of the broadest range of users. And so one of the most valuable ones, and you should almost always be using this if you can, are rich tooltips because it allows you to show basically a smaller table or smaller visual like we see on screen and provide point in time context to where the numbers are coming from. And so just in my experience, this is where we tend to surprise people. We get some of that wow factor. And we're able to help answer the question behind the question a lot of times. So I think almost any kind of operational report where people are going to be working in the data, and it's not just, all right, here's a high level dashboard, you really want to implement these. The next thing is drill throughs. This is also an area that's extremely valuable because, again, all of those kind of best practices that we talked about requires showing less information on screen. And so the way that we compensate for that, the way that we compensate for minimizing clutter, for making our reports more legible, for using bigger fonts and all this kind of stuff, is we have to find other places to add this contextual information. So one is the tooltips, but another is drill throughs. Drill throughs are awesome. You basically have a whole other report page. You specify what you want to be able to drill through on. So in this case, it would be, say, color. And I can say, okay, I'm going to right click on this bar, drill through, and then I can see, okay, what's the maybe historical detail for all the sales for this particular color. This tends to be useful in two places in my mind. So one is just when you want to go to a much finer grained level of detail. Usually what that means is we're going down to the transactional level. And so we've got a big table with a row for every transaction. to a specific context. The other is when we want kind of a panoramic view of the data. And so a lot of times that tends to be either specific customers in an accounting system or employees in an accounting system or something similar. So that you can see, okay, for this customer, what are their sales? What are their invoices? Are the invoices overdue? What have they been buying? All that kind of stuff. Or maybe for an employee, for a sales rep, you want to see how many quotes have they made? How many sales have they made? How many customers do they have? All that kind of stuff. And so with Power BI, um, we can really go a step beyond and often with very little additional effort. And so this is something I try to do with every report that I do for customers, have these two things. Um, and so what you end up at, hopefully, is kind of this spiral of growth where you understand your audience, you start with some detail, you add in some of the business meaning, and then you add in ways to interact and you add context. And so you do all these things, you go back to them, and then this starts to inspire new ideas, and it continues to be this iterate and expand kind of approach. This is what we've had the most success with whenever we're doing customer projects. Um, so want to talk a little bit about some of the recommended reading, and then I think if anyone has any questions, happy to talk about that. So I've got two books that I really do recommend a lot for improving the usability of your reports. So one, like I said, is "Don't Make Me Think" by Steve Krug, and again, it's about web usability, but in my mind, a lot of these concepts carry over. Um, some of the references are a little dated in terms of websites and that sort of thing, but I think it's a great book. And again, just understanding how people use the web really makes a difference. Another book, I think you can get this now only on LeanPub. You used to be able to get on Amazon. Is "Instructional Design for Mere Mortals" or for Mortals. It's by the guy who wrote PowerShell and A Month of Lunches, and he used to work at Pluralsight, which as a content director for their courses, and it's basically about instructional design. So this is also not necessarily about report creation, but instead it's about creating educational content for other adults. But a lot of the principles from this also apply, specifically about understanding your audience, understanding what they care about, and making sure that you're sequencing the information in an order that makes sense, and you're not just putting stuff out there just because you think it's valuable. And so these are both two books that don't necessarily have to do with reports or visual design, but have both been valuable for me personally. Um, in regards to actual visual design, one of my favorite books on the subject, I found this extraordinarily helpful, is "Information Dashboard Design" by Stephen Few. So Few is a very prolific author. We had a customer 3 or 4 years ago that was a big fan. And so as a result, I ended up reading this book because the customer kept making reference to Stephen Few's work. Now, I am a bit mixed on some of his writing because he is extremely opinionated, right? Which isn't a bad thing. But a lot of the stuff that he likes makes a ton of sense for printed reports, makes a ton of sense for information dense reports, but is not always easy to do in a tool like Power BI. So one of the canonical examples are sparklines. You can do sparklines natively now in Power BI, but it used to be that you couldn't. And there was one custom visual that could do it, but it was slow for more than like 10 of them. There was a way you could do it with CSS and custom formatting, and it was not particularly well supported. And so this information dashboard design doesn't really take into consideration the kind of interactivity that Power BI has. But the reason that I found this so valuable is it provided me with a vernacular, a vocabulary around some of these design and visualization principles. Just understanding the idea of situational awareness and how a lot of dashboards are about situational awareness, about understanding your surroundings, or in this case, the business and how well it's doing. Um, I just found it really, really helpful as a book. But again, be aware this is aimed primarily at dashboard design. So it's aimed at these high level kind of reports. And again, a lot of the things you might be doing in Power BI are more of a hybrid of dashboards and operational reports, especially when you take into consideration the cross filtering kind of stuff that we talked about. The last book I want to recommend is Storytelling with Data. Really, really great book. And this is the one where the whole pre-attentive attributes comes from. But I like it a lot just for thinking about, okay, how do we make our reports as quickly readable and understandable as possible? And so definitely recommend that. I've already posted a link for Megan's stuff on accessibility. And there's tons of other books out there, but these 4 that I've listed have been some of the most impactful for me. Do we have any questions on anything? Again, this is just kind of a high level of some things to really be considering as you start your journey to becoming a Power BI master, hopefully.
So Brad's like, where am I going to find the time to read these? Yes. Well, you sleep.
Yeah.
Don't you
So
put them on your
I will
pillow
say-
and osmosis. Did you learn
I
that
will
in high
say,
school, Brad?
so some of them are short. I know Don't Make Me Think is particularly short. And the author says that's by design, so you actually read it. Whether you just didn't feel like writing more of a book, I don't know.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you on the SQL Trail.
SQL Data Partners.